Sound good? Okay, great. I wanted to start, the staff does not know I was going to do this, but before we get to the main event, I wanted to take a minute to thank the library staff for putting this on and to encourage all of you to think about what a great thing you have going here. There are libraries all over Texas that have trouble getting New York Times best-selling books on their shelves, and your library brings you the actual author. My background, I'm a former books editor for the Dallas Morning News, and I'm also an author. I have interviewed many of the authors that have been through here on this series, and I have appeared here as an author at the Teen Book Festival. It has always been remarkable. The staff has always been amazing, and I want to encourage you, do not take that for granted. Let them know that you appreciate them, and let your, your city council, your mayor, anybody you can find, let them know that you like your library and you want this to keep going on, because it is amazing. So, speaking of amazing, Candice Millard is the author of multiple best-selling books. And feel free to clap when I say your favorites, such as The River of Doubt, Destiny of the Republic, Hero of the Empire, and the one we're here today, River of the Gods, Genius, Courage, and Betrayal in the Search for the Source of the Nile, which I understand just spent its 4th week on the New York Times bestseller list. It was called Enthralling and Heartbreaking by Library Journal. Kirkus Reviews called it an engrossing, sharply drawn adventure tale. And before I remind you, I think our books are going to be available for sale, and she'll be signing afterward. I will say, beyond all that hype, she is the type of writer that writers like me study, because we want to be her and write like her when we grow up. So we are so very lucky to have her here. Let's one more round of applause. Thank you for braving the heat and the airports and the Texas freeways to be with us today.
It's my great pleasure. Thank you so much, all of you, for coming. What an extraordinary library you have, really. And everyone I've met is so impressive. It's such an honor to meet you, Mike, and to be in conversation with you. And many thanks to Barnes & Noble, which is also an incredible bookseller. So anyway, it's a real, genuine pleasure to be here and an honor. So thank you for coming, and thank you for this conversation.
Well, let's get underway. So River of God, it's the story of men who sought the source of the Nile. I'm wondering if you could retrace your steps and tell us what was the source of this story and what made you want to follow it.
So I worked at National Geographic for about 6 years, about 20 years ago. And when I was there, as you might imagine, I was steeped in stories of exploration, stories about Africa. And I remember very well the moment I heard the story about Richard Burton and John Henning speak, and the story of their friendship and the betrayal of that friendship. And they were two diametrically opposed men, so very different, and I just found it fascinating. And then, speed up 20 years, I finished my book about Winston Churchill, and I've been struggling to write a book about Marie Curie. I really wanted to write a fascinating figure, an incredibly powerful, poignant personal life. But the problem was, with her, all the action was taking place in her mind. You know, she famously had 2 dresses, a black one and a dark blue one that she could wear in the lab, or like when she was getting the Nobel Prize or something like that. So it was basically like, well, she's still in the lab, you know. So it's just hard to make that work. So I was talking with my husband and trying to think of other ideas, and he said, you've literally been talking about Burton and Speak for 20 years, so maybe it's time to write about them. But I didn't want to just write about these 2 Europeans going to Africa and quote-unquote discovering something. But when I was reading some of their works, I read about Stephen Bombay. who's just this extraordinary figure, and had such an impact on the mapping of East Africa. And in all those years at National Geographic, I had never heard his name. And I thought, okay, this is a story I want to try to tell.
Well, as I was thinking about it, I think if you're pitching this story to Hollywood, it would be an adventure story. It would be people off into the wilderness, and horrible things happen to them, which we'll get into. But really, it's a character story, I think. And I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit more about the four primary characters, and just give me a quick summary of each of them so people know what they're getting.
Yeah, you're right. So this is a story about sort of an insanely dangerous epic journey to try to solve one of the greatest mysteries in the history of Western exploration. But really, it is about human nature. So it's things that we all know and understand. It's about genius and mediocrity, courage and betrayal and fear and envy and ambition. So all of those different things. So the leading man probably in the story is this guy Richard Francis Burton, who is one of these sort of once-in-a-century characters. He was, before this, he was already a very famous explorer. He had been the first Englishman to enter Mecca disguised as a Muslim, which was a journey that very few other people could make. They didn't have the skill and they didn't have the audacity. He also spoke more than 25 different languages. It was just really mind-blowing. And he was an incredibly skilled and prolific writer. He wrote travel books, essays, poetry, translations. But whatever he did, whatever he accomplished, he was always considered an outsider in England, always sort of looked at with suspicion and distrust. He had been born in Devon to British parents, but he had grown up in Europe. He had moved 13 times before his 18th birthday, moving from Italy to France to Greece, and he would, just seemingly effortlessly pick up languages and cultures along the way. He had also grown up fighting. He was always in fighting at school, fighting in the streets, fighting with his tutors. And to Britons, he also had this sort of fatal flaw of not looking particularly British. He had his English-Irish father's really black hair. He had these black, mesmerizing eyes that he was said to use to hypnotize women with his eyes. And Bram Stoker, who would go on to write Dracula, was obsessed with him. He met Burton, and he talked about how he was stunning. He was this force of nature. He was ruthless. He said he would go through you like a sword. But he was especially obsessed with his teeth. Bram Stoker talked about Burton's teeth, saying that when he talked, his canines showed like the gleam of a dagger. So they think that he inspired, sort of the most iconic vampire in literature. So this is Richard Burton. John Hanning's Speak was just, as I said, the opposite in every way. He was sort of, as unremarkable as Burton was extraordinary. He was kind of what Britons expected their heroes to be. So he was blonde and blue-eyed. He was born into the aristocracy. He was a lieutenant in the British Army, and he loved to hunt. He wanted to open a natural history museum in his ancestral home. But he was also, when he met Burton, deeply, dangerously envious of him. And this grew and grew, sort of unspoken over years. And every time Burton gave offense to him, sort of unknowingly, Speke would hold on to that and kind of chew on it for years. And every time Burton, received accolades or accomplished something that Speke didn't, that too would sort of deeply ingrained in him. And this, as I said, built up over years. And in the end, it kind of boiled over, and it left Burton sort of bewildered and shocked. But in the end, it would destroy them both. So those are the first two. Should I keep going on?
Yeah, because
Okay.
they're all captivating. So
Oh,
please go on.
Thank you. So the third major figure here is a man named Sidi Mubarak Bombay, as I mentioned. So Bombay had been kidnapped as a child from his home in East Africa, from his village, and he had been dragged to the coast and taken to Zanzibar, where he had been sold for cloth, and then taken to Western India, where he was enslaved for some 20 years, until the man who owned him died, and he was able to make his way back to East Africa, and that's where he met Burton and Speke. And he became, it's really interesting, he became very quickly central to this expedition. He was kind of the heart and in many ways the hero of this expedition, but not just this expedition. So he was with Burton and Speke when they went to Lake Tanganyika, which is in western Tanzania, which Burton hoped was the source of the Nile. Then he went with Speke in this sort of brutal twist of fate to the Nyanza, where Speke became the first European to see the Nyanza, which is the source of the Nile. It's the largest lake in Africa. And then Speke came back with James Grant, and Bombay went with him again. And then Bombay went with Henry Morton Stanley when he found David Livingstone. You know Dr. Livingstone, I presume? That was Bombay. And then Bombay became, with Bernie Levitt Cameron, became the first to cross the entire continent from east to west, sea to sea. So I can't think of anyone who is a more accomplished guide in the history of African exploration or did more to map this part of the world, and most people have never heard his name. So that's the third one.
And then there's a fourth, I want to make sure we get to her, but talk to me about Burton's wife, who becomes significant toward the end. I don't want to give anything away, but yeah, tell me about her too, because she's really interesting.
Yeah, so Isabel Arundel was her name, and she was very different from Burton too, in that she had been raised in a very strict Catholic family, had a very controlling mother, and they were also in the aristocracy, and so but she dreamed of a very, very different kind of life. She wanted freedom, she wanted adventure, and she ends up writing, she says, "I wish I were a man. If I were, I would be Richard Burton. But as I am a woman, I would be Richard Burton's wife." And so she waited. He was 10 years older than she was, almost to the day. And she waited 9 years to marry him. So she's, sitting at home while he's going to Mecca and he's going to Aden and Somali, and fighting in the Crimean Wars, back to East Africa. And she's fearing for his life. But she's also preparing to be his wife. So she's reading everything he's written. She learns how to ride a horse. She learns how to edit his manuscripts, which is a job he required of her. And she learns how to fence. And she sort of fervently hopes that one day she'll be called upon, to save her husband's life. But in the end, she decides, so she has sort of these twin obsessions. One is Richard Burton, and one is her faith. So she's very, very deeply, deeply religious, and he's a very open, emphatic agnostic. He studied every religion and respected none. And she's over all these years sort of trying to bring him into the faith, and it's just not going to happen. But she decides in the end that her real duty to her husband is not to try to save his life, but to try to save his soul. And the real tragedy is that she believes that the way to save his soul is to destroy his work. Which you'll see if you read the book.
Yeah, no, there were many things that made me gasp in this book. So there's so many, I think if you haven't read it yet, you can already tell. There are so many polarities going on here.
Right.
I am wondering if, as a writer, when you're crafting this, is it more fun for you? Do you enjoy getting into the minds of these people and getting into those conflicting traits? Or is that something you just have to skip over that to get to the adventure parts, which we will all pretend just write themselves. But so talk to me about what parts do you enjoy doing more?
Well, it's interesting that you say that just write themselves, because kind of they do. The action parts are much, much easier to write. than the more thoughtful parts, which are obviously what you need, right? It's not, I mean, what I always find interesting about history, and I've written about, very famous people like Winston Churchill and Theodore Roosevelt, people who almost seem mythic because they're so famous. But what's always interested me about them, and it's completely true of these characters as well, is not the moments of great triumph in their life, right, when everything's going great. It's the moments when they're struggling, the moments when they are dying or afraid or grief-stricken or they've had some great failure, right? And then you can really see, I think, who they were. And James Garfield called it the bed of the sea, when everything's stripped away and you see someone's character. And I think that's fascinating, but I also think that's where we can connect with them, because we've all had those experiences, we've all had those emotions, and that's where we can understand them better. And it is more challenging, but it's also, to me, more interesting. And so it's the parts of the book that I spend more time on, but that I really enjoy.
I want to get into how you find that out, and we'll get to that in a minute, but before, for the people who are interested just in the adventure parts, tell me about some of the stuff they endure is absolutely mind-boggling. And I was wondering if you could give me a sense of the things that they put up with to try to make this journey, to find the source of the Nile. And I just want to say, when you get to the part about the Beatles, I would like you to give me a sign, because I want to cover my ears, because I really don't know if I can go through it. So just let me, anyhow, tell me what give the people a sense of what these explorers did.
I hope you've all already had dinner. You might not be hungry after. So you have to realize that especially this central expedition that they're on in this trip, it took almost 2 years. They're gone. They traveled more than 1,000 miles, and into territory that no European. It was completely unmapped. They didn't know what they would find, and they experience attack, and they're starving, and literally their clothes are in rags by the end. And horrible diseases. So both Burton and Speke at different times are completely blinded. They have these horrible eye infections. Burton has such severe malaria that he is paralyzed, cannot walk at all for almost a year. He can't even use his hands. He's so horribly paralyzed. He gets horrible mouth ulcers and things. And yes, poor. Get ready. Well,
before I have to excuse myself, Burton, even before they get to all that, I mean, almost from the start,
right.
They're attacked.
Yeah.
The javelin.
Right. So one night in what was then called Somaliland, they are attacked by about 250 Somalis, and one member of their expedition was killed. Speke barely survived. He was stabbed 11 times, and Burton had a javelin thrust through his jaw, impaling him from cheek to cheek, that he couldn't get out for hours. And it left him with this really great jagged scar down his face that made him seem sort of more suspicious and dangerous even than he had before. For Speke, one night there's a big storm and it knocks down his tent. And so he lights a candle to try to re-erect his tent, and it attracts this horde of beetles. His tent is full of hundreds of beetles, and he's flailing away desperately at them, and he can't get rid of them, and he finally, out of exhaustion, he just lies down to sleep. And he pretty quickly feels a beetle crawling in his ear, and it's angry because it can't get out, and so it's burrowing deeper and deeper, and he can feel it scratching away. And so, out of desperation, he pours salt into his ear and butter, oil, anything, and nothing is working. And so he finally takes a penknife and he sticks it in his ear, and he kills the beetle, but he deafens himself in that ear for the rest of his life. And and it just gets worse and worse. He gets this string of boils down his face, and he can't eat for weeks, and little bits of the beetle come out in his earwax, like a leg and a wing.
I warned you all.
This will stay with you. Yeah. So, yeah, somebody asked me, because I wrote a book about Theodore Roosevelt and the Amazon, and 3 men died on that trip and things, and they said, which would you rather do? You want to do the Amazon? I was like, for sure the Amazon. I would not, no, I would not want to be on this trip.
They had, what, they almost ran out of everything but caviar or something. I mean, that's
Right, their chutney, they had
they had all the spices and everything.
Right.
But yeah, they didn't have to get beetles in there. I wanted to get into that because this is, I want to hear your thoughts. I mean, why would somebody do that? And this is a serious question because I think all of us, well, at least me, it's like, oh yeah, sure, I'd like to discover something. I'd like to take an adventure, and then I think, okay, last week I was going up to see friends in Oklahoma, and I slipped on the floor at a Wendy's, and that just almost did me in. I said, I just turn around. So there's the bravery and the courage, but this is another level. So why would somebody do that, and why do you think these men in particular wanted to do that?
Well, and you have to understand, this is, as I said, this was one of the greatest mysteries of Western exploration, in the history of Western exploration. People have been searching for the source of the Nile for 2,000 years. Egyptian kings, ancient philosophers and historians had all wondered, where is the source of the Nile? Because the Nile, it's more than 4,000 miles long. It's the longest and most storied river in the world, and it brings to life. You can't have Egypt without the Nile, right? So it brings life to this desert, and so it gives us one of the oldest and richest continuous civilizations in history. But where did it begin? So it's this tantalizing, maddening mystery. And one of the reasons nobody could find it is because they kept thinking, so it goes more than 4,000 miles and it empties into the Mediterranean Sea. So people thought, okay, we'll ascend it. We'll begin from the Mediterranean in the north and go south. But the problem is there's this huge area pretty quickly that you hit called the Sud, S-U-D-D, and it's a huge swamp. And so again and again, people would try to come down and they would hit this swamp and not be able to get anywhere. And so then in the 1850s, there were these 2 German missionary explorers who were living right around Zanzibar. And everyone had thought it was probably a desert in the middle of Africa, in Central Africa. And they had sort of this insight, and they thought, no, it's a huge inland sea instead, and that must be the source of the Nile. So the Royal Geographical Society, which had been founded just a few years earlier and had everyone from Charles Darwin to David Livingstone were members, it decides what we're going to do is we're going to start on the East Coast, well below the equator, and go inland and try to hit this huge inland sea. And what they found was there's not one enormous inland sea, there are 3 enormous, and there's the Tanganyika, the Nyanza, and the Nyassa. And so, yes, it takes really, it takes somebody who's incredibly brave, someone, in Burton's case, who's genuinely interested in the land and the people who live there, but it also takes an incredible amount of arrogance. And what I found again and again is that this is a story of arrogance. This is a story of people thinking that they can discover a land where millions of people have been living for hundreds of thousands of years, much longer than London or Paris, and that they can somehow improve their lives by, taking their land, taking their resources, because everyone understood. I mean, this was a direct and intended consequence of this exploration was colonization, and as we know, that's what happened to Africa. And so, but they genuinely thought or told themselves that we're going to improve the lives of the people who live there. So it really took a lot of arrogance, and it took someone, I mean, Burton and Speke are fascinating, especially Burton, a fascinating genius, but a deeply flawed individual. And so I think it takes that kind of arrogance and belief that you want to be remembered by history, and B, can somehow improve the lives of people by taking what they have.
Yeah, I think you make the point that the people who were discovering things, they were discovering it they were calling it discovery, but the way a lot of these things were discovered were by going around and asking, say, hey, what's over that mountain? And then you told, oh, you'll find a big inland sea. And then they say, I've discovered this. I mean, that's a gross oversimplification, but it's to your point, right?
Largely true, right. And so it's really interesting at that time because you have the explorers who would go to these places, and then you have the armchair geographers, right? And the sort of the gentleman scientists who would stay back in England, but would sort of pontificate about these parts of the world they had never been anywhere near. And so the explorers would go, and of course, they would immediately try to find guides and translators and talk to people who had seen these parts of the world. But the people at home would say, well, of course, you can't trust, anyone who actually lives there. So the explorers would come back and sort of just gloss over all this information that they had received from the people who lived there. And it's interesting, though, because I'll say I'm obviously far from the first person to point this out, and I did in the book try to make an effort to talk about all the contributions that all the porters, et cetera, the people who live there made to these expeditions. And again, I'm far from the first person who's done that. But I will give credit to Royal Geographical Society because obviously at the time there was not a lot of credit being given. But more recently they had a huge exhibit about especially some of these very, very important guides, and Seating the Bark on Bay was one of them.
I want to ask, this is about more of a character question than an exploration question, but I was curious about, for all of their, you talked about the story of arrogance, and I guess that hits the point that I'm making here, is that these are deeply flawed men. And you had to spend a lot of time with them. I'm wondering how your feelings evolved over the course of the writing of the book. I mean, I think it would be hard to spend that much time with people you didn't like. But how did you feel about it?
Well, like I said, I think Burton especially, I mean, you can't argue that he was an absolutely fascinating character. And so it was fascinating to study him. And I went into it with some knowledge, and obviously an understanding that, look, this is the Victorian age, this is, exploration. There's going to be a lot of racism that I'm going to encounter. Obviously, I need to deal with slavery. These are very difficult issues. But Burton was such a prolific writer that there was a lot of his writings that I had never read. And as I got deeper in, there were many, so it took me 5 years working on this, and believe me, there were many times when I thought, I've made a terrible mistake. I just can't do this. And so finally I just decided, A, I'm just going to be as honest as I can and do the best job that I can telling these stories. And B, I felt very strongly that to the extent that I could, I needed to try to tell Seating the Bark on Bay's story. And he was sort of the saving grace for me in that, I so admired him. I found his story fascinating, and I wanted to try to, kind of start that conversation through him.
Yeah, one of the things I loved about what you did is that they all come, I think because of that research, I guess, they come across as three-dimensional, because as much as I, even with Speak, who in some ways is villainous and Eddie, and I didn't necessarily like him always, but I had feelings for him by the end. I mean, this is not. It would have been easy to make him a simple villain. Were you tempted?
No, I agree with you. So nobody's completely bad or completely good. Most of us are somewhere in between, and that's obviously mostly the case. For Speak, there were things that, he was obviously very, very envious. He had this ambition that led him to do things that, we definitely would not agree with, but definitely not all bad. And I was very thankful to Speak, actually, because of all the explorers Seating the Bark on Bay traveled with, they all wrote about him. Burton really respected him and wrote quite a bit, but none more than Speak. And the main reason is, so Burton spoke all of these languages, and he could talk to anybody while they were there, whether it's Swahili or Arabic. But he had learned a little Anglo-Hindi when he had been in India with the military. But for the most part, before they met Bombay, he had no one but Burton to talk to, and he always, it made him feel even more resentful because he always felt sort of left out. And then they met Bombay, who also, he spoke Swahili, he spoke Arabic, and he spoke Hindi. And he was, it was, to me, the most incredible thing about Bombay is that even after losing everything he knew, everything he loved, being enslaved for 20 years, he somehow emerged from this unbelievable tragedy, not with bitterness, but with kindness. He was incredibly kind, he was incredibly generous, cheerful, hardworking, generous to a fault, and Speke came to rely very, very heavily on him, and he never wanted to go anywhere in East Africa without Bombay, and because they could talk, and so because he relied on him so heavily and really came to care about him in a way, he asked him about his life, and he asked him about his history, and he wrote about that, and so it's thanks to Speke that most of the information we have about Bombay comes from him.
That's great. You have such a gift, and I notice this across your books. You have such a gift for details. Really interesting ones. You mentioned the fact that Burton might have been, or probably was, the inspiration for Dracula. I'm wondering if you can tell me, well, it's a two-part question. Where did you find that? And where do you find that? And this would be a good time to bring up is, it's mentioned as an aside, but bring up like the Earl of Cardigan who gets a mention. Tell me those two stories, and then I have a follow-up question for that.
Okay, thanks. So this book, my other books took place over a couple of months. This takes place over 10 years, and in the middle of it is the Crimean War, and both men go and fight for a time in the Crimean War, and I was doing research on that, and one of the characters in the Crimean War, one of the officers, was the Earl of Cardigan, and his men hated him. They really had zero respect for him, but he became very famous back home. And it's really interesting because sort of a lot of products came out of this. You know, they sort of were kind of marketing like, oh, you know, you admire these men fighting in the war, can we sell you an oven or whatever, you know. And so the Earl of Cardigan started to wear this new type of vest, this wool that buttoned up the front, and it became known as the cardigan. And it's the same with the commander-in-chief of the English military in the Crimean War was the Earl of Raglan, or the Baron of Raglan, and he had lost his arm, one of his arms, 40 years earlier in the Napoleonic Wars, and so they created this new type of shirt for him the sleeve started up high and went down. They called the Raglan sleeve. It's named for him. So yeah, I mean, these are just things that I love. You know, I love reading a book and going like, whoever's sitting next to me, like, oh, wait, stop, listen to this. You're not going to believe this, you know. And so I'm always, and my husband always says he's a victim of these things when I'm doing the research, because he's trying to work, you know, and I'll call him and say, hey, just 1 second, let me tell you this story. And he's like, just put it in the book.
So this follow-up to that question, because I love that too, and I might have actually emailed somebody who said, did you know the Earl of Cardigan? But here's the question, is your writing, it is very lean. It never feels bloated, and I say this as an editor who, when I have a hard time sometimes when I'm reading something, especially nonfiction, of not mentally going through and saying, that's a wasted word, that's a wasted word. I don't do that with you. It's very clean, it's very lean, and yet you have these little side diversions. I'm wondering, how do you decide which of those stay in and which go out? Is there some kind of test that they have to pass? You know, like if your husband doesn't say, wow, thank you for interrupting me, that should stay, or how does it work for you when you see something? Is it just a judgment call or what?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's interesting, and you know this much better than I do, but with writing, I was talking to a young person not too long ago who said, how do you kind of find your voice? And just like the ideas come through the work, your voice comes out, right? And when I wrote about Winston Churchill, and I remember when I was in England, somebody asking me, do you write like an American woman? And I'm like, well, I guess I am an American woman. I don't know. I write like myself, right? And I think that's all you can do is sort of write like yourself. So to your question, I mean, I kind of keep in what I think is most interesting and hope that other people do too. And I edit and edit and edit and edit and take things out. And there are things that sometimes I think it's really interesting, but probably nobody else will. Or do you think, it's a distraction? I just put it in the footnotes because I think, I haven't really seen this anywhere else. It's kind of this interesting thing, but it is a distraction in the story. So yeah, I'll just stick it there.
We're in a few minutes. We're going to have Q&A. So if you guys start thinking about your questions, we'll have some time for that. I wanted to, before we get there, beyond this book, I wanted to talk a little bit about your own journey as a writer. And my understanding is that your launching pad was the very notable hotbed of narrative writing talent, Veterinary Forum.
That's right. Everyone loves that, right?
Yeah,
It's your favorite.
Tell me how you got there, and then how you ended up here today with your third, with however many books, however many weeks, all the books, all the weeks on the New York Times bestseller list.
So I went to graduate school at Baylor, actually, and thought I was going to teach, but then ended up really hating literary criticism, which is the way it was going at that time. So I moved back home to Kansas City, penniless, moved back in with my parents, and got a job at Veterinary Forum. And I had never had a pet. I mean, I literally had never. I was like, okay, here we go. But it was a great opportunity. And then I worked for this trade journal company we were talking about, which was a great experience for me because it was really small. I mean, each magazine had like 3 people on staff, and some of it we would share between us, and so you kind of had to do everything. So I learned a lot about everything else. And then I kept wanting, my dream was to work at National Geographic, and they had this a 1-800 number. This is in the 90s. They had this 1-800 number for supposedly for jobs. And I would call it every day, and there were never any jobs, And then I thought, okay, I'm just going to really shake up my life. I'm going to join the Peace Corps, and I'm going to go somewhere interesting. I can learn a language, just learn stories and things. And so it sounds like a joke, but this is really true. My boyfriend's college roommate's twin brother's friend was working at National Geographic. And the twin brother, he had been in the Peace Corps for like 6 years in Sierra Leone, and he lived in Washington, D.C., and the Peace Corps headquarters is there. And I had like a ticket I had gone on some business trip, and because I was making like $20,000 a year, nothing, and I couldn't afford to just fly to Washington. But I called him, and he's like, if you're going to do this, you should come talk to me. So I took this free ticket that I had, and I went, and we had dinner the night before. There was an opening for Madagascar, for a place in Madagascar with the Peace Corps. The night before we had dinner, and he said, if you could do anything, what would you do? And I said, well, I'd work at National Geographic, but I know there are no jobs there because I call the hotline every day. And he said, well, you know what, I have a friend who works there. Let's stop by tomorrow on our way to the Peace Corps. And I met his friend, and his friend told me about an opening in the research department in TV. And I don't know anything about TV. I really wanted to be on the magazine, but it was a door. And so I got that job, and I moved to Washington. And I worked there for a few months when I found out that, so on the magazine at that time, they had a department called Legends. The legends are the captions, which is, to be honest, that's most of what people read, right? From National Geographic, they look at the pictures and they read the legends. And the legends are sort of a little art form, right? Because at that time they had 12 people, and that was their whole job. They did that and kind of ghost wrote for scientists and photographers. And they have to have a beginning, middle, and end, and they do their own research and everything. So when there was an opening, they would have a contest, sort of, and it was anonymous. And we were talking about one of the best things about writing is it's a meritocracy. It doesn't matter where you went to college. It doesn't matter who your parents were. You can write or you can't write. That's all that matters. And so this was an anonymous test. They give you the article, they give you the layout, and you have a month to do your research and write your own thing. And 300 people applied for this position, and I got it. And thank you very much. And I still remember that moment because at National Geographic, if you've ever been there in Washington, it's sort of a U-shaped building, and the magazine's on one side, and sort of the rest of us are over here. And I remember they called me and said, you know, come over and we'll talk to you. And so I went across the courtyard, and they told me I got the job. And as I was coming back, my friend who had got me the first job, he had an office looking onto the courtyard, and he said he saw me literally skipping across. Because I got to my office, and he called me, he's like, did you get the job? I was like, how did you know? He goes, I saw you skipping across. So that's how it started.
We are so glad that you did. I'm going to ask one more question, I think, and then we will get questions walked across Africa with these characters, and then having read your other books, you know, which involve all kinds of horrible deprivations, you know, people, you know, Winston Churchill hiding on trains and coal mines, and all, you know, and Teddy Roosevelt, you know, almost to the point of suicide in the Amazon. As those of you who have read her books know, I am just curious, have you ever been in an airport and heard somebody whining about missing a flight? Have you ever wanted to tap them on the shoulder and say, you want to hear about travel problems?
Right. Do you have a beetle in your ear?
Yeah, I was just curious.
No, I mean, it's funny because I had the sort of great fortune to be able to go to a lot of these places where these stories played out to do the research, and it's just been amazing. But it makes me very grateful, that I'm not traveling during those times. But I have had my own sort of little dangerous episodes. When I was doing the research for this book, I was able to go. First of all, I had been planning it for years, and I finally find a time I can go, and it's February of 2020. And I don't know, I think it's going to be fine, but I ended up, and it was fine, but I got home March 8th or 9th, so I just sort of got back in the door. But I was in Zanzibar, Tanzania, and Uganda, which was really this incredible experience. But when I went to Lake Tanganyika, as I said, was Burton had hoped was the source of the Nile, and it too is just enormous. I mean, it's a sort of slash in the land, and it's just incredibly long. But when you're on it, it feels like you're on the ocean. It really does. And one day I was supposed to get from one shore to the other, and it's a journey of a couple of hours. And there had been a big storm, and it took forever for the boat to get to me. So by the time it did, it was dark, and the waves were really, really rough. And my husband was with me, and we get in this little boat. I mean, it's maybe can hold 10 people. It's wooden, it's open, and we're on basically a storm-tossed sea. And we were literally just flipped this way and this completely over, and I was terrified. And I said to my husband, look how far the shore is. If we capsize, there's no way we can swim that far. We won't make it. And he said, don't worry about it. The crocodiles will eat us. And they would have. They were full of crocodiles. But anyway, we survived.
So maybe not getting a boarding on a Southwest flight.
That's right. There's no crocodiles.
Yeah, wow. And I just have to ask, because I came across it, were you not with him? Were you flying over the Amazon once? And,
right.
Okay, I'm sorry. This is worth hearing. So what happened?
So I was doing research for my first book, and my oldest child, I have 3 children, my oldest child was just 8 months old at that time, and she was back in Kansas City with my parents. And the only way to get to this river, this tributary that Roosevelt was on, I mean, it's deep, deep, deep in the Amazon, and the only way I could get there was I had to hire a pilot and rent my own little plane to fly for hours over absolutely unbroken jungle. And Unfortunately, we had this kind of inexperienced young pilot, and we stopped one day in this rubber tapping village, and we were there for several hours, and we come back to the plane. Well, this is the Amazon, right? And it's the rainforest, and it's the rainy season, so there's a lot of moisture in the air. And we get in, and he didn't sump the tank to let the extra water get out. And so we're flying a single engine plane and over the Amazon in the middle of nowhere. And you know, if you're in those little planes, it's usually pretty loud. And all of a sudden, and it was silent. And the water had gotten into the engine. And the engine went out while we're about 1,500 feet over the Amazon. And we just dropped like a stone. And I remember thinking, if we crash, I hope we die immediately because no one will find us. B, my husband was with me again. I'm an idiot. I just orphaned my child. And C, look at that guy, and he's clawing. He's like literally clawing at the controls, and it really is a miracle. He restarted the engine in flight, and we were able to keep going. But the problem was too, you know, this was my first book. I didn't know if I could do it. Doubleday's taking this chance on me. I had planned and saved to go on this trip. And I had all the, so Roosevelt was there with this guy, Candido Rondon, who had taken careful, he had mapped the whole way and written down all these coordinates. And I had a GPS, so I knew where all these things happened that I wanted to see. But this pilot was just so terrified, he was basically useless to me after that because he just wanted to land. You know, I'm like, hey, I need to keep going. You know, we have to keep going. But and you know, things happen. So sadly, just a few months after that, 2 freelance photographers for National Geographic did die in a plane crash over the Rio Negro. So it does happen. It's real.
Wow. Well, thank you for all you do to produce these fantastic books. We have time for questions, yes? Okay, so, yes, here.
I've written about President Garfield, and you have a lot of dialogue with people there. Do authors, the historical fiction or the history, do they make up some of the dialogue, or how do you know what's the dialogue? How do you know the dialogue?
Right.
For those who couldn't hear, the question is, if you're writing history, do you get to make up the dialogue? Is that
Right.
So please, yeah, that's a great question. How do you do that?
Is it real? Is the dialogue real?
It's absolutely real. And so that's the thing with narrative nonfiction that I always say, you need not just a lot of primary source material, you need so much primary source material, letters, diaries, newspaper articles, books, that you think you're going to drown in it, that you think you'll never get through it all, and that's where I get the dialogue. So someone might say in a letter, you know, and we were talking about this, and I said to him, blah, 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 and then I use that. And the same thing, you know, people they'll write their own books in these experiences, and they'll talk about conversations that they had. And so, yeah, absolutely everything. And I know that there is historical fiction, and there's some really good historical fiction. That's not what this is. This is completely nonfiction. And that's why I always say, and a lot of times with narrative nonfiction, people in their notes, they'll just have like a paragraph or two for each chapter saying, this is roughly where I got this information. But I say exactly where for each thing. You can look it up in the notes and find where I got that piece of dialogue or that actual detail. I have very extensive notes.
It's what separates the great ones from the average ones, and this is why we say, let me go over here, yes.
Question I have is, you said the President's wife destroyed his material. Did she destroy it all, or how did you find out who was
Right, so she said, I talked about Isabel Burton's wife destroying his work. And so what happened is, no, thank goodness, most of it survived. He was, as I said, very, very prolific. And most of letters and books and things survived. So what happened is, near the end of his life, so this book builds to this really shocking, tragic event in which Speke dies. And you have to find out how to read the book. But Burton survives, but by that time, he's sort of been shunted aside. You know, he's ignored, he's kind of penniless, he's angry. But what we were talking about before about being stripped away, so he's sort of left with the essence of who he was. And that was a scholar. He loved to learn. And he loved languages and he loved other cultures, sometimes in a kind of twisted way. But what he starts doing near the end of his life is doing these, he starts translating these great works of literature, but they're works of erotica. So it's like he translates Arabian Nights, he's the first to translate the Kama Sutra into English. And his very religious wife is really upset about it. And also there are all these obscenity laws and things at the time, but he finds it very amusing because they sell like hotcakes. He makes more money from this than anything else he had ever done in his life. So that's so he's older and he's sort of getting sick, and she's thrilled because she's kind of has him to herself. But he's working on a translation of The Scented Garden, which is another work of erotica. And he's really proud of it, actually. He tells her one night, he's like, look, I'm almost finished, and this is my greatest work. This is my magnum opus. And he said, but more than that, this is my gift to you, because he knew he probably wasn't going to live that much longer. And he said, this will sort of ease your old age, because you can sell it for a lot of money. And he says, I'm going to finish it tomorrow. And he dies early that morning. And she's devastated, but she insists on this big Catholic funeral for her agnostic husband. And then she comes back to their house, and she goes into his room. There's this big roaring fire, and she has this work that he had told her, is sort of the greatest work of his life. And she thinks about it, and she's been offered, thousands of pounds for it. And she thinks, what he would want in this earthly life, she believes is different than what he surely wants in heaven. And she thinks, it's my job to try to save his soul, and to do that, I need to destroy his greatest work. And so she takes it, and she describes it page by page, and feeds it to the fire. And it's really interesting, she writes, and she was actually a really talented writer herself, and she writes, if he could see this, would he rise up and bless me or curse me? And she said, the question will haunt me to death.
Great description. Yes.
This is kind of a small question, but describe it sounds like a Swiss Army knife.
Right.
That bird has, but I saw that the patent wasn't until later, so I just, where did you find that?
Oh yeah, I see what you're saying when he has that. He has what he calls a housewife that has so he can sew, and he can, so he describes the kind of thing. So yeah, it does kind of seem like a Swiss Army knife, but it's not. But he has a, right, I don't know exactly where it came from, but yeah, and then that's one of the blessings of this, that he keeps all these detailed notes, and even in his books he has these appendices where he talks about when he would go to the markets in Zanzibar, what he would buy for these long expeditions, and the different kinds of currencies, and so he has all these great descriptions, and so I got it from there. Yeah. Oh my gosh, that's my good friend Robin from Baylor. Hi.
My question is, once you've done all these manuscripts, right, you've done your research, you've written, you've edited, there's still a lot of moving parts here. You have a title, you have a dust jacket, you have this fantastic audiobook reader for your books. So can you talk to us a little bit about what goes into that part of the process? The titles all have a pattern. Is that deliberate? You have the noun and the preposition. Did you do that on purpose, or did it just happen over time? So, what goes into all those kind of what seem like little details, but obviously really important parts of the process?
Right. Yeah, the titles, nothing's on purpose, actually. And it's just like people are like, oh, did you want to write about another president after you wrote about the... No, it's just another... And it's definitely, believe me, I was like, okay, it is another river. I do realize that. But whatever, it's a great story, so hopefully people will forgive me. So yeah, it is an interesting process after. So the main part of mine, like I said, is about 5 years. I do a couple years of research, just casting a very wide net. Spend another year or so organizing the research, going back and doing more research when I find I need it, and then I spend another year outlining it. And then it's not until the very end, the last year, that I start writing. But then after that, after I turn in the manuscript, it's another year before it comes out. And my husband, he was with the New York Times for years, and he's like, oh my God, I cannot believe it still takes a year for a book to come out. But there is a lot that goes on in that time. And I work with my editor. We usually go back and forth on the titles. Some are mine, some are his. Usually they just come out of the book itself. And then he works on, he has, obviously a really great staff, and they come up with the cover. And I will say, it's really great. They send it to me, and I have vetoed pictures before. My 14-year-old son especially loves the Garfield book. One of the pictures they sent, or one of possible covers, is him. It's the side view of him, and there's smoke that's supposed to be looking like it's coming out of his back, but it looks like he chewed it, yeah. And my son was like, this one, you have to use this one. I was like, I'm definitely not going to use that one. So that is this whole process of going back and forth with that. Thank God they hire somebody to do the index, which is a really hard job. The hardest part for me, so afterwards there's a fun part and a hard part. So the fun part is I then gather all the pictures. And sometimes they're all over the place, most of the time actually, from many different archives. And I write the captions because that's what I did at National Geographic, so I always have these kind of long captions because I like doing that. And then the bad part is the footnotes that I just talked about, because as I'm writing, I'm keeping the footnotes going, but then you have to transfer them because you don't want, numbers and things in the actual story, right, to break up the story. So you have to do the leading sentence notes, and I have to do all of that, and it is incredibly tedious. And it's that terrible combination of being very tedious and also terrifying, because I'm always worried that I'm going to get off by one, and then every single no will be wrong. So you have to really pay attention, but it's very boring. So that's what goes into that process.
For the record, you've just heard the first writer in history ever to say, I like doing the captions.
Yeah.
Nobody has ever said that before. We have time for one more, and I've been looking, I thought I'd seen a hand up back here somewhere. No? One more? Do we have any more questions anywhere? Well, I saw you first. Go ahead.
So what's next?
Oh, I know, that's such a mean question. Yeah. My husband and I always laugh because when he was in New York, he said if you're at a cocktail party and you're talking to somebody and they're being annoying, you just say, oh, how's the book coming? They're like, oh yeah, I better go. I better get back to it. So I do have another idea actually, and I actually just sent it to my agent, and fortunately she's really excited about it. I can't say what it is because I haven't sold it to my editor yet, but I'm really excited about it, and I will say that it's about a woman. And I have been trying for years, like I said, I tried with Marie Curie, and I've been looking for many years to write about a woman. The difficulty with narrative nonfiction with women is that, women have been doing extraordinary things throughout history, but other people haven't been writing about them. When I wrote about Winston Churchill when he was 24, 25 years old, but everybody was paying attention to him. He came from a famous family, but he was also just this extraordinarily arrogant, outrageous, brilliant guy. It was very obvious early on. So everybody around him was writing about him, and you need that. And so, women have been doing these things, but nobody was really paying attention, or at least they weren't writing books about it or newspaper articles or things. And like I said, you need a lot of primary source material for this kind of writing. But I think I finally found one, so wish me luck. Yeah.
I will speak. I speak for millions, I'm sure, when I say good luck. We can't wait. And for everybody in this room, thank you for being here. This has been great.
Thank you.